The Atlantic world was a world of slave societies, and more specifically, African slavery. But why? How did Europeans manage to enslave Africans? Perhaps the most important part of the answer lies in recognizing the difference between the early modern world and our own. There, pretty much everywhere, unfreedom was the common condition of most people. Most Europeans lived on the land in some condition of bondage, serfdom, indenture, peonage, until the 19th century, and in Eastern Europe until the late 19th century. England was a partial exception because there, by the 17th century, the system of feudalism that had tied peasants to the land was starting to crumble under the pressures of an emerging agrarian capitalism that forcibly dissolved those old bonds and released land and thus people into the marketplace. But this was the case only in England and maybe in small parts of the Netherlands, and only beginning in the 17th century. It was the beginnings of a very long process. Everywhere else in Europe, old patterns held. Freedom was a new, unusual, and revolutionary idea, and its ascendancy was incredibly slow, at least until the late 18th century. Unfreedom, in other words, was the common condition of working people in most of the world. And slavery, which had emerged in many parts of the globe, was hardly anomalous in this respect. Slavery and the slave trade were already well established in African societies by the time of European involvement in the trade. And the relationship between the two, African slavery and the transatlantic slave trade, has long been a flashpoint of interpretation. John Thornton laid out one pole of the debate. He said there was, quote, an enormous slave population in Africa at the time of Europeans' arrival and during the whole era of the transatlantic trade. The historian G. Ugo Nwokedzi offered another point of view. He said that slavery existed everywhere, but was present on a large scale only in a few places before the 17th century. The only safe generalizations, he says, is that slavery existed in West Africa, but expanded after the takeoff of the transatlantic trade. In West Africa, most of the people subjected to slavery were captured in war, although slavery was also used as a form of punishment for debt, for crime, and in some cases to get rid of political rivals. The possession of slaves was one of the main means of accumulating and displaying wealth for economic and political elites, and that meant that the enslaved were likely to be owned by merchants or state officials, precisely the kind of people Europeans would come into contact with. Africans had their own ideas about who could be made into slaves, and like other communities, that didn't include their own people. By their own lights, the people they captured and enslaved were not other Africans. That term had little meaning in the continent itself in the early modern period, and it acquired meaning only over time and mostly actually in the diaspora. But part of the complication is that West Africa was one of the most ethnically and linguistically diverse parts of the globe, and like the rest of the early modern world, it was not a place of nation states. And if you take a look at this map of West Africa in this period, you will see the ethno-linguistic diversity and the number of peoples who were clustered along that part of West Africa impacted by the transatlantic slave trade. Opportunities to enslave and the vulnerability to enslavement was also tied up with the changing political landscape of the region in the 15th and 16th centuries, and particularly with a very rapid process of state formation that was underway. It involved a significant redrawing of political boundaries, the collapse of some polities, and emergence of new, increasingly powerful states like the Asante, for example, in the gold-rich regions of Ghana, whose armies included slaves. War-making and slave raiding was a significant element of this political process. So part of the story of slavery in Africa is about the rise of states with the power to enslave people on a massive scale. Slavery was widespread in West African society when Europeans arrived, but the status of slaves there was very different than from what it would become in the Americas. Within West African society, slavery played a number of crucial social roles. It functioned as a means of labor recruitment, as a status symbol, as a system of domination and exploitation, and as a way of expanding the lineage. The means by which a person was enslaved was crucial in deciding their fate. Some slaves, especially those captured in war, were held as transit or trade slaves, and they were the ones most at risk of sale. But if some, or maybe even most slaves, were always seen as heading towards the market, other people held as slaves, domestic or family slaves, or slaves born within the household, had already experienced a degree of incorporation into the household and kin group. The diversity of slavery had crucial implications for social belonging and for the status of the slaves themselves. It meant that there was no one status associated with being a slave. Some, warriors and administrators, could have very high status, and women slaves were desirable as wives because marrying a slave woman gave a man unhindered access to her productive and reproductive labor without any contest from her family of origin. Children of slave wives were free. So in other words, the property rights of masters were clear in all cases, but they also tended to recede over time. Above all, it was the absorptive or corporative element of slavery in Africa that distinguished them from the systems that would emerge in the Americas. Certainly, this was one of the points the slave Olaudah Equiano seemed anxious to make in his account of his own enslavement in Africa and sale into American slavery, and it's one of the main reasons I asked you to read the document. It was an account that was offered, like so many others, only in the late 18th century with the rise of the anti-slavery movement, so it has to be read carefully with a sensitivity to the context, but still it offers us a valuable first-hand account of that experience. Europeans entered and drew on a well-established system of slavery, slave trading, and slave delivery that predated European contact, a domestic or internal and external trade, the latter mostly across the Sahara. To get an idea of the transatlantic trade and its impact, it helps to start by looking at the overall patterns. And if you take a look at this table and focus on the first column for the period 1500 to 1600, you will notice the transatlantic trade at the bottom, and that number, not an inconsequential number of people even in the 16th century. But you will also see, I think, that it's a new part of a series of long-standing patterns of African trade in human beings across the Red Sea to Arabia, across the Sahara to North Africa, and from East Africa and the Indian Ocean to the Middle East, North Africa, and India. And in fact, if you take a look at this map, which shows you the extent of the slave trade in the whole period to the beginning of the 20th century, you will see those older parts of the trade marked there on the continent of Africa. Part of the story these numbers tell in the early period is about the spread of Islam, often by war. It involved the continuous large-scale movement of enslaved populations from non-Muslim to Muslim areas, and this is why the Trans-Sahara part is the largest part of the trade. Sub-Saharan Africans formed an increasingly large percentage of slaves in Muslim societies in North Africa and the Middle East, and in those areas a strong connection emerged between dark skin and slave status. And because of the practice of polygamy and the desirability of slave wives, many slaves in Africa were female. In West Africa in particular, this element of jihadi slave raiding was part of the larger process of war and political transformation I mentioned a moment ago, and one that committed a political elites to slaving. Enslavement became so basic to the political economy of West Africa, one historian has said, that political survival was impossible without it. By the 17th century, there was a highly dynamic relationship between wars of political centralization and the goods available, including guns and gunpowder, from the Atlantic markets, and between those Atlantic markets and the human commodities African leaders took to the waterfront and offered, often along with gold, as payment. In fact, it was a market logic that grew on pathways already established by the trade in gold. The trade in enslaved people, in other words, was a long-standing part of African political economy across the continent, including in West Africa. Control was always in African traders' hands, and as we will see, that didn't change with the opening of the transatlantic branch of that trade.